Okay, so I've got a lot of slides. I shall get going. If you're at the panel this morning, you know I've been doing this for a very long time. I'm old enough to remember when CSS first came about at all. And I was trying to do CSS layout back in the days of Netscape 4, which was entertaining. So thankfully, things have actually got a lot better. And actually, CSS itself has become incredible in the last few years. We can do things like animation directly in CSS, which is pretty amazing. But the thing with layout is actually it's kind of been stuck back in that past. Layout hasn't changed a huge amount, while the rest of CSS has really moved on since CSS became modular with what we call CSS 3. And so we've got this stuff in CSS layout. A lot of the layouts we're doing rely on floats, and therefore we have to use kind of clear fix hacks and things. There is absolute positioning, but that's not really any use for big layouts because things overlap. We use things like display table. That became popular for a while, sort of making CSS pretend to be a table. But that's not really ideal. You end up with quite a bit of redundant markup. It's a bit weird. And a lot of people are using inline block as well, but that respects white space because it's essentially display inline. And so you have to do things like remove all of the white space from your HTML, otherwise you get gaps, and that's stupid. So that's not great. And Flexbox came along, and a lot of people are saying, well, all of these problems go away when you use Flexbox. But the thing is, Flexbox isn't designed for full-page layout. It's been designed to lay out things that are one-dimensional, so stuff that can be in a line, really an unbroken line, and it kind of can wrap, and you can kind of fiddle around with that wrapping behavior, and you can make it sort of grid-like, but you end up with another bunch of hacks when you do that, because it's just not been designed for grids. It's been designed for making flexible layout of user interface items. And so as we're seeing these kind of Flexbox-based frameworks come up, a lot of them suffer from exactly the same hacks as we have with floats and so on, because they're just trying to do something with Flexbox it wasn't really designed for. And we're able to obviously do layout, and we're doing layout with all of these methods and a combination of these methods usually, but they actually come at quite a cost. You know, if you think back to maybe when you learned how to do layout with CSS for the first time, it takes ages and it's full of really baffling things and things that just don't make any sense. You know, show CSS layout to any sort of traditionally trained designer and they're like, what? You can't have two equal height columns? You know, it's that sort of stuff that we've been trying to do for years. And there's also a cost in terms of our documents. We can't order our documents in a semantic way quite often, because by the time we deal with all our different breakpoints, we're having to say, well, let's change the markup to make all those different layouts work, and that's not ideal. We're also adding a lot of markup to create grids. We're seeing classes and also extra markup. If you look at things like the bootstrap grid and so on, all of that stuff is getting stuffed into our HTML rather than being in the CSS. And we're often using preprocessors. I'm not against preprocessors, I use them, but we're kind of relying on them because the maths for complex layout is really hard. And I've wanted for a very long time, really since way back when, you know, when I was first doing layout, I thought, you know, it'd be great if we could just build a grid and put things on it. And as responsive came along, well, we want to be able to redefine those grids and move things around at different breakpoints. We need a fit-for-purpose system that's designed for the kind of complex websites and the web applications that we're building now. And I really believe that we have that with CSS grid layout. This specification, believe it or not, first appeared in Internet Explorer 10 about 3 years ago. I started talking about it because I saw that it was there in IE 10, so I picked up on it there because I spotted something that I thought was quite interesting, started writing about it. And I'm going to show you in this bunch of slides why I like grid and why I think it solves a lot of the problems that we have today. I'm going to do that with a lot of code. So this is some HTML. We've got a div. It's got a class of wrapper. It's got two child elements, one with a class of A, one with a class of B. I want to make wrapper a grid. So I say display grid. That's a new value of the display property. You can also use inline grid, and we'll create an inline level grid with that. We then use some new properties. These have been created for CSS grid layout. We've got grid template columns, which creates columns, and I've created 3 100 pixel wide columns. Grid template rows creates our rows. So wrapper now has this grid of 3 content columns and 2 content rows. And it looks a bit like this. If we could actually see the grid, we'd have something a bit like, it'd actually be collapsed down, but it's something a bit like this. So if I want to place that div with the class of A top left, I'd use the following properties. Grid column start and grid column end allow us to define the lines before and after where the content sits. Grid row start and grid row end define the row lines before and after. So CSS puts the item A into the top left cell of the grid. And we could place B bottom center with these rules. And we're only spanning single cells here, but the end line for the column or grid can be anywhere you like. So this would let us span B across 2 content columns. And you'd find that example of that URL, and all of the examples in these slides, and I'll give you a link to the slides later, they all link to live examples. I will explain the browser support in a bit. There's also a shorthand for the column and row properties. So this is quite verbose, and as with most CSS, we have shorthands. So we can compress these into 2 lines, like this. So we have grid column and grid row. The first value is start, the second is end, and they're separated by a /. We can actually go a step further than that and use grid area and define all of the lines at once. And the order of the lines is bafflingly grid row start, grid column start, grid row end, grid column end, which is essentially, if you think about it, the opposite direction to shorthand for margins and padding. I do not know why. I actually think that's very confusing. I don't use it. I use the 2-line method instead, because I think that's quite confusing to look at. It's worth knowing, obviously I'm working in English, so my examples are indexed left to right. If you were working in a right to left language, such as Arabic, you would be indexed the other way. So there's a bunch of new terminology in the grid spec, heaps of new terminology, and some of the basics. We have grid lines, we've already seen those. So we've got horizontal and vertical lines. They can be numbered, they can also be named, and we'll have a look at that. Then we have grid tracks, so that's any row or column between 2 adjacent row or column lines. So here we've got a grid track running across, highlighted in red. And grid cells, that's the smallest possible unit on the grid, so it's between 4 grid lines, and conceptually that's just like a table cell. And if we join the grid cells together, we get a grid area. So that's any area bound by 4 grid lines, and that can include many grid cells. So the area is simply defined by just setting your start and end lines. You don't need to use any kind of span keywords, although we do have span keywords in grid, and I'll show you those. I've got lots and lots of examples, many more than I'm going to show today. I've put them on a website called Grid by Example. I could put new things up there as I build them, and I'm trying to break down the spec into small examples because that makes it a lot easier to understand. At the moment, the best browser to be using is Chrome. Actually, Chrome Canary is probably more useful, and you need to enable the experimental web platform features flag. I'll talk a little bit about browser support though later. So what we've looked at so far is line-based placement, and let's take a look at a more realistic example, something you might actually build. So this is a very simple layout which you could build by any of our existing methods. And it's got HTML that looks a bit like that. A parent with a class of wrapper and 3 child elements for the different areas. And without any layout applied, it looks a bit like this. So that's just how the source would display. So to get started, we set up a grid, just like in the simple examples. And I'm creating 2 columns and 2 rows, which would create 3 row lines and 3 column lines. Now, there's a funny looking unit in this definition, this FR unit. This is a fraction unit. And I'm going to go away from our layout for a second just to talk about that. So this represents a fraction of the available space in the grid container. If you've done any Flexbox and you've looked at FlexGrow, then this works pretty much like FlexGrow does. So if I've got a very simple grid, we've got 3 columns, all 1 FRs the width, and that creates 3 equal width columns. If I change the definition and create first a 600 pixel width, so an absolute width column, and 2 1 fraction unit columns, what grid does is it first gives that 600 pixel width its space, it gives it the 600 pixels, it takes the rest of the space, divides it into 2, and gives it equally to the fraction unit columns. And so if we change the last column to 3 fraction units, the remaining space would now be divided into 4 and shared between the boxes in proportion. So this, just like FlexGrow and FlexBox, lets us build flexible layouts that have some fixed width elements in them. And if you are old like me, you will realise that that means we can do the Holy Grail layout that we used to long to build. The 3 columns with the fixed width sidebars. And so basically that's how you would do it in grid. Not that that is the sort of thing that we're aiming to build these days, but you know, it's kind of nice to know that we can finally do it. So, back to the layout that we're building. So I've created 2 columns. I've got a 2 fraction unit one and a 4 fraction unit one. So we're dividing the available space in the container, whatever width is there, and assigning 2 units to the first column track and 4 units to the second column track. We've also got some properties, grid column gap and grid row gap, which create gutters between our columns and rows. I believe at the moment they are not in Chrome proper, they are certainly in Canary and I think the Firefox implementation. If we declare a grid, we don't position anything. We get something slightly strange occurring. This is because grid has this auto placement algorithm and it will actually lay your items out on the grid for you, which can be quite useful. I've got examples of laying out images and things on the grid just using the auto placement rules. But most of the time you're probably going to want to actually position things. But it's useful to know that what's happening here is grid is putting each element into a cell on the grid, because that's really all it can do without any instructions. So here I am, I'm positioning my layout. So I'm spanning my header across the grid from column line 1 to column line 3. The panel is a sidebar, so it starts in the far left column line 1, ending at 2, and the content area is just sitting next to it. And so we end up with this simple layout. Now if you notice, we've got this sidebar here, it's got a grey background which extends all the way to the bottom of the layout. But that's because it knows it's in the same row as the thing next to it. And that's really the difference between things like Flexbox and Grid and all the things that came before them. Items in our layout have relationship. They know that they're part of an overall layout and they can then respond to other elements in the layout. That's what makes them better. Because with things like floats and positioning, you're really just sticking things independently around your page and then trying to force other things to behave like they know they're there. And so that's why this stuff is so much easier to deal with. And if I put the lines on so you can see where the actual cells of the grid are, and those sort of fat lines are our row and column gaps. And basically the gaps act just like a fat line. So you can't position anything into them, they just space things out. And that layout is there. Now perhaps I want to put a footer onto this layout, so I can just add it to my markup. And I can then position it right across the layout from column line 1 to 3 and put it between row lines 3 and 4. And there it is. And it'll sit below. There's no kind of clearing or anything required because it's in its own row. It can't pop up no matter which column's longest. That's not going to happen. And if you're observant, you might have realised that there isn't actually a line between 3 and 4. There's no track there. I've not created that in my grid. It doesn't exist in what we call the explicit grid. So grid has explicit grid lines. They're the ones that you create. You define your grid and you say which lines you want. We also have these implicit grid lines. If you position something outside of the grid you've declared, grid will create more lines for it. So this means you can carry on adding content. You don't have to think, oh, I'm going to need 10 lines, I need 10 rows. It'll just carry on adding things. and they'll be auto-sized by default, although you can specify the size of those implicit tracks if you need to. When you're thinking about rows, you tend not to want to specify the size, you just want them to stretch to fit whatever sits inside them, which is the default behavior. So actually, for many layouts, and for the layout we were looking at, you don't actually need to specify rows at all. Grid will just create the auto-sized rows as you position items into them. Anyone else who has been around for a long time might be thinking, this looks like tables for layout. And it does, and I think conceptually, if you ever built things with tables for layout, that's kind of the easy way to think about it in your head. But there are key differences. I mean, the big difference is that you're not relying on source order. Things can be in any order in the source, and you can then display them. But also, because they're described in CSS and not in the HTML, that means we can move things around on the grid using CSS at different breakpoints, which makes this really great for doing responsive designs. We can introduce a grid at any breakpoint, and we can redefine grids at any breakpoint. So a quick look at that. With the same HTML as I had before, I'm going to start mobile first and do a very, very simple responsive layout. So I'm here using a grid. It's essentially a one-column grid. I'm just using grid layout to rearrange some of the elements. I've decided that something would be better higher up on a phone. And so I'd end up with something like this at the narrow breakpoint. So then I have media query, a simple media query, and I can redefine my grid, and I'm now going back to that two-column layout that we had before. So grid makes it really easy just to shift things around based on media queries. You don't need to worry about source order, so you can let the content and the kind of desired user experience dictate where things end up. You don't need to think, well, this is the markup we're stuck with, this is what's come out of the CMS, and then, do your best job with the layout. You're really freed up to think about how best to display that stuff for different breakpoints. So far, we've looked at numbered lines. Now, a grid always has numbered lines. They're always there. You can always position things based on line numbers. However, you can also name those lines, which becomes useful if you're working with other people or you're working with responsive designs, because actually the numbers of the lines might change, but you can give them a name, and then you can always refer to, content start or what have you. So we'll go back to the same layout, same underlying HTML markup, and we'll have a look at how we would actually name the lines in that layout. So this is how we name lines. So we have these square brackets, and then we have the name of the line, and then we have the definition for that. So that could be auto, or it could be whatfr, or 20 pixels, or whatever it is. So the name comes first because you're naming the line, and then you have the definition that says how wide the track is, or how tall the track is, and then the next line. And positioning the items is exactly the same, except we use the name of the line rather than the numerical position. So instead of having something like this, we'd end up with this. So again, that's really useful for responsive design, because if things move around on the actual grid, as long as you know what the line names are, you can always target where they are. And that's a bit easier for people to remember, because you can name things sensibly around the grid. But there's a whole other way of describing how to position items on our grid. And this actually goes back to a spec that is very, very old. And in fact, the reason I got into this was because I saw Bert Boss from the W3C describing this template layout idea that he'd come up with. And this is where this named areas idea comes from, and it's now part of the grid layout spec. So again, we've got the exact same markup. We're trying to make the same design. This example can be found here. So the first thing I do, outside of any media queries, is I want to give a name to the various page elements I want to position. And this grid area is what we used for the very short shorthand, the one line declaring all the lines at once. We can also use it to give that area a name. So I can say that the grid area header is the class of main header, and so on. So here I'm setting up my grid for the mobile width layout. I've got my single column layout with the rows. I set up the grid, and then instead of positioning each item with its own rules, I'm just describing the layout as the value of the grid template areas property. So that's it. That's a layout. Inside grid template areas, I'm just saying which order I want those areas to go in. So I get a narrow layout, and that's the areas overlaid. And you can see this more clearly when we go to our full width layout, our desktop layout. So inside the media queries, I've redefined my grid into this 2-column grid, and here I am in grid template areas basically describing what my layout looks like in what some people have been calling the ASCII art syntax. We're actually describing the layout as the value of that property. So we've got this layout, and there's the named template areas overlaid. Now, for straightforward layouts, this is a really nice way to work. I've been using it for about 2 years to prototype layouts as I've been learning this. If I have to build anything or just prototype anything, I do it using this because it's so quick. You can just move things around and you can define things and redefine them and see how it works. It makes sort of prototyping responsive design really, really quick. So a couple of things. If you repeat a name, that causes the element to span cells. So we can do that with the header and footer. And you can have multiple white space characters in between the columns, so you can line things up neatly. Some people are very, very keen that you can line these things up. And when you see some of the very complex ones that people have created as part of working out how the spec should work, lining things up is useful. So you can add multiple white space, that's fine. If you want to leave a cell empty, use a full stop, a period. You can actually use multiple full stops as long as they don't have any space between them. Once again, that's so you can line up your ASCII art nicely. And when you see these things, you know, with all the dots and things in, they do look very much like ASCII art. So here I've decided I want the footer just to sit below content, so I've got a dot and then footer. And so we'd end up with that. Then footer would just sit down there. Something else that happens when we use named areas is we get implicit named grid lines. So grid starts creating for us named grid lines based on the named areas that we've created. Sounds crazy, but it's absolutely true. You sometimes wonder where these things come from and, you know, who decided this would be a good idea. But anyway, if we've got this named grid area called content, grid creates for us content start and content end, both for rows and for columns. So you'll get your contents, you could use content start and content end for a column, and the same for rows. So I've got an area test, and I have said I'll position this content start, content end, and on the rows I'm going to position it on the row content start, but then I'm going to take it to row footer end. So I've also got footer. And what happens is we get this. So that red block is now positioned using those implicit lines. I've not declared those lines anywhere, but Grid's created them just based on the names of my area. What this also shows us is that we can layer up items on the grid. I gave this test area a higher Z index than the other items, and so it's displaying on top of them. So this really is another benefit over kind of table-based layout in the olden days, in that here we can actually layer stuff up, and I think we'll start to see some really interesting things as designers get their hands on this and realize that you can actually layer elements and animate things around grids that are layered up. So layering just uses Z-index, just the same as anything that's positioned, same as absolute positioning. So that's really quite useful, and will be interesting to see what people do with that. So I've looked at some very simple examples, which is great, nice and easy to get started with. But I think that when people today think of grid systems, what you're thinking about are the kind of 12 and 16 column flexible grids, like we see in things like Bootstrap. So this is example code from the Bootstrap framework. Now you can abstract some of this stuff away. You can say, you know, use Sass, so you don't actually have to have all these classes in your markup. But when you actually look at a lot of Bootstrap sites, those classes are right there in the markup. You know, a lot of people are they just build things like this. And you know, there's arguments for and against having presentational classes in your markup. I really don't care which side of the fence you're sat on. This is there's only so far that you can go with stuffing this stuff into the markup. There's only so many breakpoints you can cope with by doing this. And if you decide you want to have another breakpoint, do you want to go and have to add more classes to all of your markup? That just seems crazy. So, you know, they're conceptually quite heavy, this kind of grid. And with CSS grid layout, what we're doing is we're defining that layout completely in the CSS in a way that we can only do by using a preprocessor at the moment. But because it's in the CSS, it's live. So you can change that and it can react to what's happening in the browser. It lets us flexibly redefine grids. But the thing about switching something like Bootstrap for CSS grid layout is that you need to start thinking in a different way. If you try and just directly replace Bootstrap with grid, you end up with something very strange, and we're seeing things like that happen with some of the Flexbox frameworks. They've just attempted to take the way that sort of Bootstrap and things works and turn it into the way Flexbox works, rather than seeing these things differently. So I've got an example actually using the skeleton framework. This is a lightweight CSS framework. It's got a grid similar to Bootstrap, but it's a little bit lighter weight, so a bit simpler to demo with. But you do the same sort of thing. You add rows and classes to your markup to define the grid. Before I go into that example, I'm going to introduce just a couple more things about grid layout that are useful to know. So if we're going to create a 12 or 16 column grid or more columns, these grid definitions are going to start getting really long and quite difficult to read, and they're very repetitive a lot of the time. We have grids with equal columns. So you can use this repeat keyword at any point in a grid definition, and basically the sort of 4 here, the first number is saying how many times you want to repeat a pattern. You have a column, and then you have your pattern. So here I'm saying I want 4 times a grid which has 200 then 100 pixel tracks. And so you can do that. You can also have things either side of that. You can just repeat part of your grid if you want to. So that's quite useful. We looked at named lines earlier, and this example uses named lines. But if we're using the repeat keyword and we've got named lines, we're going to end up with multiple lines that have the same name. And this is really useful. We can use a span keyword to span multiple lines. And that's what's going on here. So I'm naming lines as col A and col B, but I've got that repeated 4 times. So when I position my content, I can actually say, you know, start on the second line named col A and span 2 lines. So that's quite a useful thing to be doing. It's a lot easier to see in the full example. So we can have named lines, we can have multiple lines, and we can basically span between those lines. So, here's some markup. Now this is the markup for the skeleton grid. It's a bit simpler than Bootstrap, but we've got the same idea. We've added divs for rows, and then we're stating in a class the number of columns a column can actually span. So, you know, it's not too bad, but that's quite a lot of markup. And this is just a little example. It's on the skeleton site, and so it creates a grid that looks a bit like this. So that's using their default grid. So, for the grid version, the first thing I do is I remove those row divs. We don't need those. We're going to define any rows in CSS. And also I remove all the classes that declare what the grid does because we don't need those either. In this example, because it's just an example, I'm using box 1 to box 11 in my classes, but they could also be completely semantic class names in reality. But what we've done here is removed any description of how the grid works from the markup. And I then create the grid, which looks a bit more complex because I'm using the repeat keyword. And I'm naming the lines, so we're going to have multiple row and column lines. Having done that, we can now pop some things on the grid. So I want box 1 to start in the first line named col and span 4 lines. It goes in the first row, so it starts at the first row line, and it spans 1 line by default, so I've not put an ending line. By default, things will go into 1 cell unless you specify an end line for them. So that puts box 1 just there. Let's have a look at box 8. So I'm starting on column line 7. I'm spanning 3 lines. Because we're using these named lines, we don't need to worry which line of the grid the third line after column line 7 is. We just know we want the 3 columns. And so that will place box 8. So I put together this completed grid layout version, and I'll give you the link at the end so you can go and look at the full code. So we can easily replicate something like Skeleton or Bootstrap or Foundation. We can replicate their grids fairly easily, and I've played around with all of those. But Grid lets us do something that really takes us a step further than that, and that's to also control the grid rows. So we can span rows in exactly the same way that we span columns. So I'm setting up here a couple of those boxes to span 2 and 3 lines. So in this third example, I'm not just putting things into single rows, I'm spanning rows. And you can see that the heights there, they go to the gutter. No matter how much content is in the block, that behavior is basically the same as Flexbox because they share the same alignment properties. They're stretched by default, so that's what you'll get. And so that's all at that URL to have a play around with. And I really would advise going and having a little poke around with this stuff in a supporting browser because it becomes an awful lot clearer when you actually get your hands on the code. So what we really do with these grid layouts is we build layouts on top of a grid framework. And so here's our layout from before, but now built using this sort of flexible grid that we've created. So the header and footer start on the first line named col, span to line 12. The header starts after the first row line and the footer the third. And between them we've got the panel and the content sitting side by side just as before. So we end up with our layout again, and once again I've got a URL you can have a look at. It makes it really easy to play around with layouts. Perhaps, instead of having this full width footer, I'd like the panel to extend to the bottom of the content and the footer just to sit under the text, and I only need to change a few values to do that. So we have this CSS, and we can update it to change how our footer sits. And then it looks like this. And it's really easy to start moving things around and tweaking the design because we're not having to worry about clearing stuff. We're not having to worry about which things are going to suddenly start overlapping. And this ability to move things around really easily. I'm a huge fan of this specification. I've been working with it and I've been spending quite a bit of time chatting to the people who are doing the spec authoring and also some of the browser implementers. And it's a really exciting spec, and I think coupled with Flexbox for Flexbox for the sort of smaller UI things, then Grid for big stuff, it's going to be incredibly powerful. But Grid and Flexbox to a slightly lesser extent raise some real concerns in the potential for them causing accessibility problems. Because once you have separated the display completely from source order, which they do allow you to do, then you can create some horrendous messes very, very easily and very, very quickly. So with this sort of great power that is coming in, it comes some responsibility. And way back when I sort of started getting interested in layout stuff, it's because I worked with Macromedia. I was part of the Web Standards Project, and one of the things, the reason I was brought into the Web Standards Project was to work with Macromedia to try and get the output of Dreamweaver to be more accessible and standards compliant. I know what horrible things authoring tools can do when they have good ways to sort of move content around. Back then it was table-based layouts. Now I'm very worried about what might happen with things like Grid. Because ideally, they should let us create the most accessible source document, really great, solid HTML source documents, and then use the power of reordering to display things in the most optimal way for each breakpoint, but always thinking, how does the person using a keyboard to navigate get around this? How does the person using assistive technology use this? There's a real danger that the reordering capability will just let people forget about source order and think, oh, it doesn't matter what comes out of the CMS, I can just move it around using Grid. Even worse, things only become Grid items in the same way that things only become Flex items if they are a direct child of the parent, the thing that's got display Grid on it. So I think there's a real danger that authoring tools in particular will start to flatten out the source, removing semantic elements in order to make everything the child of a grid and make displaying things around the grid really easy. The current draft says that grid item placement and reordering must not be used as a substitute for correct source ordering, as that can ruin the accessibility of the document, and I'm sure everybody takes very seriously the things that the specs say and never does anything different to that. And we know from history that is not the case. So both Flexbox and Grid shouldn't change. So the logical order in the source is like what the tab order should follow and is what text-to-speech browsers are going to follow. So you can imagine how you can very quickly make a big old mess if someone's tabbing around, and I use the keyboard a lot to navigate around sites. You can imagine the sort of mess you can create. Adrian Rosselli has been putting together some examples of grid and other layout methods and how tab order currently works in different browsers. Actually, not all browsers are doing the correct thing according to the spec at the moment, and there's certainly some argument about this. I've written a bit about this concern I have around the flattening of markup, and the thing is, there's actually something in the spec for grid which I think could solve a lot of the problems around this flattening out issue. And that's to do with the subgrid keyword. Because it's perfectly valid, just like with flex items, a flex item can become a flex container itself and have flex items inside it, but they become independent. And as it is with grid, you can make a grid item, you can also declare display grid on it, and it will become a grid itself. So I've got here a set of divs, each of the class of box, but box D has E, F, and G nested inside it. If I declare a grid on the wrapper and position the direct children, I'd end up like this. So the light boxes in here, E, F, and G, are the direct children of box D, so they're not part of the grid. They're just displaying inline as they would, as you'd expect them to. So I can declare a grid on D there and set up its own columns, and then I can position its children on its own unique grid, which is this. So essentially here we're nesting independent grids. But really, I think what a lot of people would like is to be able to create a grid on the top level item, on the parent, say this is my grid, and everything else just position. It doesn't matter whether it's a direct child or whether it's something inside. If it's your navigation that's inside a UL, you want the navigation to respect the outer grid. And there is something in the spec that should let us do that, the subgrid keyword. A grid declared as a subgrid would use the grid specified on the parent, so it would enable kind of grids all the way down. So we could use the subgrid keyword rather than setting up those columns and rows. And if we position child items, they would be positioned according to the parent grid lines. But that feature is at risk in the current level 1. There is pushback from browser vendors who would like to ship grid without it because they think, no, it's quite complicated and we'd rather just get grid out there. I think that is a problem. One of the spec authors thinks that is a real problem. There are quite a few people in the accessibility community think that's a real problem. We shall see what happens. I think that without it, we have this problem where particularly authoring tools, but probably developers as well, will just think, let's strip markup. It'll be much easier then to position our items. And I think that is a general worry. On that point and on many other points, grid needs feedback. This is a spec in development, but it's fairly close to being complete. It's going into a phase, it's really finer points now, and implementations. But this is the time to talk to the W3C and to browser vendors about a spec. It is no good waiting until something is implemented in browsers and it is at a sort of a candidate recommendation. At that point, you can't really say anything about it. It'll have to wait till the level 2. When things are in development is the time to say, I see a problem, and to let people know. And if you don't believe that regular web developers and designers can make a difference, this is the post on the list where the grid column and row gap properties were added to grid, and that was mostly because I went on at the spec writers for well over a year saying, we need gaps in this because otherwise people have to create fake column tracks. So, you know, anyone can post the mailing list, anyone can bend their ear and talk about this stuff, and actually they're really interested. They don't get a lot of feedback from developers. So it's really great if you can do that. Just quickly, browser support. IE10, IE11 and Edge have the old spec, the spec that was created for the way they sort of started, so the very early version. That's what's there. Edge are committed to re-implement against the new spec. Chrome and Chrome Canary has the best, it's really in Blink, really, and so Opera as well, has the best support at the moment. That work has been done by an open source consultancy called Egalia and has been paid for, interestingly enough, by Bloomberg. So that's why we have a grid spec, that the implementation, which is as good as it is. They're also porting to WebKit. It's in WebKit Nightlies. Firefox are making huge progress. A lot of stuff is implemented now in Firefox and works. You can play around with it. To say grids on the Edge backlog and marked as high priority. I try and keep track of where we are. It changes all the time because we're talking about nightlies and things. Things change quite quickly, so sometimes things don't work. But that's, I try and keep that more or less up to date. All my examples are here and I'll be posting more. And really that's it. You'll find my slides there with links to all the code. I'm Rachel Andrew on Twitter. If you want to talk about grid, I like talking about grid, so very, very happy to. And I hope this has been helpful. Thank you. Yeah.
I have like a ton of questions, but it will break a kind of break. So, anybody?
They all look stunned now.
It's amazing stuff. So,
do have a play with the examples. It's kind of, it's interesting to play with, and oh, here we go.
I was wondering what the projected release date is.
Pretty soon. I mean, I think it's, the thing is with grid, it's going to land fairly hard because they're keeping it behind a flag until it's kind of sorted, so we don't get this Flexbox problem of, you know, one thing coming out and then change has been made and then all the browsers doing something different. So when it lands, it'll land in a pretty complete state is what's going to be quite nice. I mean, hopefully this year. I think it's the battle now is about subgrid and whether that is implemented or whether we wait for it to get out there. But yeah, I mean, you'll see if you look across the browsers, they're all really converging on having an implementation now. So yeah, hopefully fairly soon.
You said that CSS grids will be more for complex layouts, whereas the Flexbox will be more for certain elements.
Yeah.
Is this your interpretation, or is this really how the specification kind of defines it?
Yes, that's how they've been written. In fact, there's a really good description. I'll link to it from my site that Tab Atkins, one of the spec authors who wrote both Flexbox and Grid, where he describes the difference between the two, and it's
Not a replacement for Flexbox, but rather
no, it's in fact that the two of them share all their alignment properties are defined in a different spec, which I also talk about sometimes. So yeah, so basically we're talking about now kind of a system of specifications as opposed to competing methods. There's a kind of a layout system that's being created by the W3C and by browsers, which is going to solve just general problems around layout. So Grid's kind of a part of that.